Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Rob Schultz and I teach AP Computer Science A at Bellbrook High School in Bellbrook, Ohio. And this is video number 3. This is AP Computer Science A, AP Daily, and we're still in topic 1.1. This is the third video in our 1.1 little series. And with this one, our goal is going to be to look at some syntax and logic errors. We've written enough programs now that we probably need to start looking at how do we deal with specific errors as they pop up. So what we're going to learn is, again, kind of going back and looking at some of the things that we've picked up from previous videos. How do we look at specific errors, or I should say, how do we identify and correct errors when they pop up in our program? So we're going to focus specifically on a couple things that we've done in past videos. For example, system.out.println moves the cursor to a new line, while system.out.print does not. And we'll look specifically at what happens if you accidentally use the wrong one. We're also going to focus on the fact that a string literal is enclosed in double quotes. And we're going to touch on the idea that, if you don't include the double quotes, or if you only include one of the double quotes, that's an example of something that can cause what's called a syntax error. So let's start by looking at the 3 flavors, or I guess the 3 categories of different errors we could run into. When we write code in Java and we run our programs, the 3 different varieties of errors that we could run into are syntax or compiler errors, exceptions, and logic errors. And we're going to focus specifically on the syntax compiler errors for now and logic errors. We'll get to exceptions a little further down the road. So the idea behind a syntax or a compiler error, one of those errors occurs when we violate Java's syntax. Every language, whether it's a spoken language or a programmed language, has a specific syntax. In English, we have a certain syntax that we follow when we put nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs together. Java's a little more detail-oriented than we are in the English language. If we mess up our syntax, you can still generally get the meaning of what someone said. But in Java, if you do something syntactically wrong, the program's not going to let it compile. So some examples, and these are just a couple of examples. If I have system.out.print and I accidentally misspell out, or if I make my S lowercase instead of uppercase, or if I forget a semicolon, these are all things that are considered syntax errors in Java. Depending on the IDE that you use, some IDEs will detect syntax errors for you automatically as you type, kind of like Microsoft Word or a word processing program will automatically put the little red wavy line underneath. Some IDEs will do that as well. Even if your IDE doesn't do that, your program is not going to compile or run while there are syntax errors present. And at the time that you compile it, you'll get a list with line numbers that tell you roughly what the compiler thinks the error is and what line you can find that error on. So syntax errors are generally pretty easy to find relative to some of the others. Logic errors logic errors are a little more difficult. Okay, logic errors are usually detected after a program's been run when we compare the anticipated output to actual output. So this is when we have to make sure that we have good test data identified, that we know what it's supposed to do, so that we can compare what it's supposed to do to what it actually does. And if those 2 things don't match, then we know that there's a mistake somewhere that the compiler is okay with, but we've made a mistake. And an example, and again, this is just one example, would be that if I'm trying to find the sum of 2 numbers and I accidentally use a minus sign instead of a plus sign. If my test data says that I'm going to use 5 and 2, then the sum of 5 and 2 should be 7. I can anticipate that that's what the output will be when I test. If I plug in 5 and 2 and I get 3, okay, well 3 and 7 obviously don't match. That means logically there's a mistake somewhere, that I've done a miscalculation or I've misspelled something, or something to that effect. So we're going to focus today on identifying syntax and logic errors. Okay, now I've got some code on the screen, and again, if you've been following along the past videos, this looks probably pretty similar to the past programs we've done. The name of this class is Find the Bugs, because I have a couple bugs purposely thrown in here. There is a combination of 10 errors in here. I believe I put in 10. I think there are 5 syntax errors and 5 logic errors. Okay, and this is our anticipated output. This is what our program should produce. All right, I want to display the line, this is a test. And below that, I want to display the line AP CSA rocks, and I want the cursor to be waiting on the next line after that. So in a second, I'm going to ask you to pause. And when I ask you to pause, the first thing I want you to do is I want you to try and identify the errors without the use of an IDE. Okay, kind of trace through the code, pretend you are the compiler, do exactly what the compiler would do on a piece of paper, and see if you can identify first off where the syntax errors are that would keep this from compiling, and then see if you can identify the logic errors that will prevent it from appearing the way it's supposed to on the screen. Once you've done that, type the code into your IDE, compile it and run it, and you'll have to resolve the syntax errors before you can compile. But then once you've run it, see if you can resolve the logic errors to make sure that it displays the correct output. Once you've done those things, press play, and then we'll come back and we'll kind of break this down a little bit. I'll point out where the syntax errors and the logic errors are. Okay, so go ahead and press pause, and when you're ready to continue, press play, and we'll keep going. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So how'd you do? Were you able to find all of the errors we were looking for? Let's take a little look. So step one, before this will compile, before we can even check to see if our output matches, we have to identify the syntax errors. And in this case, like I said, there were 5. Okay, you'll notice in the second line there are 2 different errors. I forgot the I in print line. I forgot the second quotation mark in our string literal inside the parentheses. Down in the 4th line, I missed the period between the M and the O. In the last line, I accidentally made system lowercase instead of uppercase, and I forgot the semicolon. So before we can even compile this to run it to see what the output's actually going to look like, we have to fix those. So as if by magic, poof, there we go. Okay, so all of my syntax errors have been corrected. The next thing we now need to look at is we need to compile it, run it, and make sure that our output looks the way it's supposed to, because we also have a variety of logic errors in here that are going to produce incorrect output. So when we look at our logic errors, okay, notice what I've done is I've accidentally switched print and print line in these 5 lines. So this is what our actual output looks like, and the actual output does not match the anticipated output, which tells us we've got logic errors in there somewhere. We're getting incorrect output. So the next thing we have to do is we have to correct all of the logic errors. I want ISA to follow this, and I want test to follow ISA, which means that I can't have a print line because then I don't want the cursor to go to the next line. I do want a print line when I display the word test because I do want it to start a new line after that. Both of these should be just regular print because I want the cursor to remain on the same line. And then at the very end, I want the cursor to move down to the next line and wait, so I need to use a print line. So really, you know, I've flipped each of these 5 lines. So once I correct those, okay, and now I rerun the program, we get our actual output. We get exactly what we were looking for. Now, I should point out at this point, there was another way that you could have corrected this. Okay, notice we've got 6 lines of code to produce 2 lines of output. And some could argue that that's not necessary. You could have just as easily solved the problem and resolved the logic errors by doing this. And this is a perfectly acceptable solution. We can take each entire line and simply display them with a print line, kind of the way we did with our string literals in video number 2. Okay, so if you did this as your solution, this is a perfectly acceptable solution. In fact, some would argue that this might even be a better solution than this one. Okay, and I'm fine either way. Again, the goal was to make sure that we understand how to use print and print line to make sure that everything is showing on the screen where it's supposed to be. All right. Okay, there we go. We've just had our first introduction to debugging and looking for syntax and logic errors. As far as the takeaways, okay, system.out.println moves the cursor to a new line. System.out.print does not. Keep in mind that if you accidentally use the wrong one, it might produce a logic error. In other words, it might produce incorrect output to the screen, or it might show up on the screen in a way that you didn't plan for it to. So that's an example of something that can cause a logic error. The second little essential knowledge piece down there is that a string literal is enclosed in double quotes. If by some chance there's a mistake with the double quotes, if you forget the quotes, or if you're missing one of the quotes, that's an example of one of the things that can cause a syntax error. And, you know, just remember there are a variety of things that can cause syntax errors. Just have to kind of tackle them one at a time as you compile, and you get that little list. So that's the end of video number 3. Thank you for watching. Again, please continue to watch the videos as they come. I hope everybody has a great day, and I'll see you the next time.